everyone. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for this session on demystifying the acknowledgement to country. Firstly, we would like to begin by acknowledging the lands that we're all meeting on today. And we've got a very interesting map that's been created by our colleagues in university infrastructure, which shows all the land that the University of Sydney occupies. At the moment, I'm actually sitting on Darug country as I working from home in North Parramatta, and that land we have our Westmead campus. But as you can see from this map, while we have the Eora campus, the Camperdown campus in Sydney, we do have a lot of regional lands, regional campuses that are on lands across New South Wales. So I just wanted to acknowledge those lands that we are all coming from today. I wanted to acknowledge the elders of those communities that have held the knowledges and the education that we benefit from today. And I just wanted to, acknowledge the histories that have come from these lands, and as we talk through more about how we acknowledge country today. And I also wanted to make a special mention of Eddie Mabo, and today being Mabo Day, and our Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters who have also, we want to acknowledge their contribution to what we call Australia as well. Thank you. I'd just like to welcome Professor Jakelin Troy, who's here with us today to talk through how we demystify the acknowledgement to country. We wanted to make this session very interactive and really wanted for you to use a lot of the facilities we have here in the chat, in the Slido, to really talk through what your questions are when it comes to acknowledgement to country. We just wanted to spend a few minutes up front just talking through the differences between a welcome to country and an acknowledgement to country. So I'll just bring Jackie in here to explain, we'll just talk through the differences for us. Jack, you're on mute.
No matter how expert we get at this technology. Thanks, Katie. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and it's wonderful to be here. And I feel very supported by elders of the community and community members. And the lovely thing for me is I'm right next door to my own country, which is Narrogoo, the Snowy Mountains of southeastern Australia. At the moment, we still can't go onto our country because it's mostly national park and it's closed off, but we're looking forward to when the COVID restrictions end or we move to stage 2, as I understand it, we'll be able to move back onto country, which is wonderful. And it's snowing down there. So all of you who go down to the Snowy Mountains this year, if you're skiers or snowboarders or just like being in the snow, think that you're on Narrogoo country and you travel through Wiradjuri country and Ngunnawal country. And if you come from Sydney, you're going through, as Katie said, all the different clan groups, Gadigal from Sydney University, down through Gundungurra country. If you go down the coast, you'll go through Dharawal and all the other coastal groups to get to my country. So wherever we are in Australia, this is my way of opening up the thinking that if you look at this little map that's still up there on the screen, as I understand it, just in southeastern Australia alone, you can see how many different groups of people there are. So if we think that places like Europe are complicated, look at Australia, and all of these different boundaries represent different language groups, different social and political groups. Within each of those boundaries, there are smaller groups. So in the Sydney area alone, there are about 27 or so clan groups that call Sydney their country and have specific territory. So if you're at the Camperdown campus of Sydney University, you're on Gadigal country. And the word Gadigal comes from the word for the grass tree, the Xanthorrhoea gadi, and Gal means the people of. And if you go out to Parramatta or Boromata, you go into the country of the eel people, the Bara, and Baramada probably means the people who are responsible for the eel making ceremony. So the Gadigal are the people who are responsible for the ceremony, the continuation of the Gadi ceremony. So again, leading into the idea of what is country and who are people. Wherever we go, you move through language groups, you move through cultural groups, you move through clan groups. It's extremely complicated moving around Australia if you're an Aboriginal person. It's complicated if you're a Torres Strait Islander too, and many Torres Strait Islanders live in on the mainland of Australia and down in Tasmania, which is, well, it's another island, is, you know, part of our whole landmass really. So it's really important for people to understand that acknowledging as you move through people's country is a very real thing. If you want to move between all these different groups of people through all these different languages, and they still all absolutely exist and are thriving. All the languages of Australia, there are at least 400 of them, has a community that identifies with each of these languages, 400 plus languages. And within those language groups, as I said, lots of other different little clan groups and socio-political groups. So as you move across Australia, you need to be thinking about whose country you're on, acknowledging that you're on that country, and understanding that country. And traditionally, and the traditions are not something of the past, so our traditions are like the traditions of non-Indigenous people in Australia. If you go up to somebody's house, you go up the garden path and you knock on their front door, and they will welcome you at the front door, and they'll ask you to come in and have a cup of tea, I hope. And you know, there are ways in which you go into people's houses, into their spaces. If you come to the campus of the university, there are ways that you're able to come in. In some cases, you have to have swipe cards to get in. And that's because it's protecting the people in the buildings, it's protecting you. So there are all these things that everybody does around the world that allows you to go into spaces safely and to be safe in those spaces. And this is what welcomes to country in our traditions are all about. When you are welcomed by the people of a country, so wherever you are in Australia, think about where you are right now. If you don't know what the language group is or what the clan group is, then it's worth finding out. But as people come into that country, the people of that country would welcome people in. They would do things like actually rub the sweat from their armpits onto the back of the person being welcomed in, so that they smelt like people of the country, so that the ancestors and that the places, the country itself, knows that you are part of country. If you think about it, this is like making you a member of the country. This is our philosophy in Indigenous Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't see people as outsiders. If you're an outsider and you come in, you need to be made part of the group. This is what happened in 1788 when Australia was invaded by the English. The first fleet arrived and the local Aboriginal people were looking at these people thinking, well, how do we welcome them? How do we make them part of what we are? They've never encountered people like this before. It wasn't an immediately hostile situation because we have ways of making everybody safe in our country. Of course, if conflicts break out, that's a completely different situation. And of course, all over Australia, this happened. But what we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are wanting to do now is to make more frequent, more common, this idea of welcoming people into our countries. We want everybody to understand what this means. And we also want people to understand what it is, if you're not of that country, what it is to acknowledge country, what it is to say, I know where I am, I acknowledge the people of this country, and I am thanking them for having me in their country. Katie, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it's
audience participate. Yeah, come on with
for all that commentary. I think it's, you know, amazing to understand that in that context. I think really understanding the difference between a welcome to country and the acknowledgement to country. So for a welcome to country, that needs to be performed, like Jackie says, by the people of that land, of that area. So for when it comes to when we do as a university setting, Welcome to Country, we do reach out to the local Aboriginal land groups around those places. So for Camptown campus, that's Metro Aboriginal Aboriginal Land Council, and we ask them to come and, you know, it's not a formal welcome to country, but, you know, just a process, a protocol of welcome to country. And I think the difference with an acknowledgement to country is that anyone can acknowledge country. And like Jackie was saying, we should be doing it as in all parts of how we live our lives. The protocols around, we do meetings, we do start with acknowledgement to country. And that, you know, it's really good as an Aboriginal person to be seeing how that has become part of our everyday. And so it's really, I think it's a privilege to come and have these discussions and talk about how we've seen acknowledgement to countries, how we can encourage people to do their own acknowledgement to country. So we really wanted to open up this session to you and to your questions. So feel free to keep those coming, and Stephanie's going to help us facilitate some of those questions. So so I just want to, like Jackie spoke a bit about her background. My background is I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman. So my family come from Cowra, which is Western New South Wales, and you'll see from that lovely map there is quite a few people that come from the Wiradjuri land. So we do very, very proud to be what we call a Wiradjuri warrior. And, you know, those histories and those knowledges that we interact with today. So Stephanie, did you want to talk through the questions? And
I've got one that's come up. I've got my speaker off mute, so we're going to play it like this, I think, Katie. I'll jump in here.
Yeah.
So I just saw one question pop up. It's maybe if we have the speaker view and I can see my the questions coming through as well. But somebody asked whether it's Gadigal or Cadigal. So this is a very good question, because it leads me into saying, what do you do if you want to use local language to do an acknowledgement? Of course, people who are from the local community will often do an acknowledgement using the local language, which is as you'd expect. And even where languages are very much in a renewal mode, people are using the opportunity of welcomes to country to renew the use of their language, to keep their languages going. It's really a very good opportunity for us to hear our Australian languages. So in acknowledgements and in welcomes, it's good to use language. I say for when I'm on the Sydney Camperdown campus, I say in Gadigal, Nyini Nalawangun Maribadiri Gadinurada, which literally means here we are today sitting down together on the beautiful Gadi country, so the land of the Gadigal mob. And that's a small acknowledgement in Gadigal. It doesn't matter whether you say Gadigal or Cadigal, it's just a sound difference. And in 1788, when the First Fleet cruised into Sydney Harbour, thinking they were going to occupy country that was already actually the sovereign country of the Gadigal mob and already occupied, you would have heard people saying both Gadi and Caddy. That's just a small sound difference. It doesn't change the meaning of the word. If you said instead of Gaddy, you said laddie, that would mean something completely different. So if you change the sound completely at the beginning of the word, it will change the meaning. But there are a lot of sort of normal variations. If you listen to anybody speaking language, you get small variations. Katie and I sound different. You'll sound different to everybody in your family. So that's what that sound difference is. But generally we say that Aboriginal words start with what we call a voiced sound. So the difference between g and k is that when you say g, you use your vocal cords, they vibrate, and when you go k, there's no vibration of the vocal cords. So most Aboriginal words, if you like, start with a voiced sound using your, if there's a choice between, say, b, p, t, d, g, k. Okay? So some more questions.
That one, the Gadigal, Cadigal, I think it's mostly the difference is in print. And I think you will find that for a lot of the languages and the nations, because obviously it was an oral language, and it was how it was written down by settlers, and obviously Jackie can talk to a bit more about that. But I think a lot of times where you will see it written one way, it's also then in another way in brackets, or also known as. So there's no right or wrong. It's one is in more use than another version, but like Jackie says, they're both correct.
Yeah.
So,
but it is good to use language. If you, I often now in Sydney also use what's a very common greeting amongst the Sydney mob. As we say, I say warami. So a simple acknowledgement is just to say hello in somebody's local language. Yeah. So if you meet somebody in the Sydney CBD area on Gadigal country, it would be nice to greet them, whether they're Aboriginal or not. Get people using the local language. This is something that in language renewal, some people call it language revival. It's really important to have the languages used. So that's what acknowledgements of country are, ways of people thinking to themselves, what is important about me being in this place? It's an Aboriginal place or a Torres Strait Islander place. Why am I here? What is my purpose here? And what is my connection to this place? So when you do your own acknowledgement, whether it's opening up a meeting like this or just greeting somebody on a daily basis. A lot of schools now start the school day with something in the local language saying, as I said, it's good to be here on this country of these people in this beautiful place, you know, that we acknowledge a long tradition has been in place for people for tens of thousands of years. If everybody knew this kind of thing, and if everybody started or at some point in their day thought about the Aboriginal community or the Torres Strait Islander community, if you're in the Torres Straits, whose country you're on, and on Mabo Day, you know, he made it important. Eddie Mabo was somebody who fought for the native title rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, really, in the end. And those rights are also the rights to be acknowledged in our own countries, to have the right to welcome people into our countries, not just assume everyone can come in without even thinking about it. So if you think back to that map, if you're travelling around southeastern Australia, if that's where you're coming from in this chat, then wouldn't you want to think, oh, whose country am I going into now? One of the great things in travelling elsewhere in the world is going from, you know, if you're going across Europe, you're travelling from one language group to another language group across national boundaries. Well, we're doing exactly the same kind of thing here in Australia.
Yeah. So I just seen some of the questions come through. Just wanted to say, yes, you can, the Gadigal language that Jackie's talking about is available. There's actually a book called The Sydney Language that is written by Jakelin Troy that is available, and it does have a look at the language of Sydney. I know from my personal experience, I've recently started learning my language, Wiradjuri. And it's amazing feeling to be able to speak your own language. So I actually do my acknowledgement a lot of times. I'll do it in Wiradjuri, even though I may be on Gadigal or Darug country. That is my people. So I use the language of my people to acknowledge the land I am on. But I do love learning more about the Gadigal language as well, and try and intersperse when that can happen as well. So that was, I saw another question. Jackie might want to talk through this around, do elders have to give a welcome to country? From my perspective, I believe that yes, we want our elders to be the ones giving our welcome to countries. I think there are representatives by our communities that aren't elders that have been giving the permission to conduct welcome to countries. So I don't think it always has to be an elder, but it does have to be a representative, an appointed representative of that community that gives a welcome.
And, you know, back to how we do these things traditionally, there are people who are responsible for various parts of any group's country. So depending on where you are in country, There could be, if you're being invited to a ceremony in a welcome, then the person who can call on the ancestors, who can call on country, and people do that. They literally stand and they say, hello, you know, I'm in language, introducing this person to you, talking to the country and talking to the ancestors there. And again, if you think about ancestors in our traditions, time, past time and present time is pretty much all together. We have what we call synchronous time, really. We have a future, but a present, but the present and the past are very close. So we do, of course, have a sense that something happened, 2 or 3 days ago, whatever. But we also know that everything that's ever happened is still, in a sense, happening around us. So all the ancestors, all the creation of country, spirit, all the people, all the entities that help create country are still all around us. That's why it's really important to let them know you're bringing someone in. So if you're going to a ceremonial site for a particular thing we call business, doing business in an Aboriginal sense is to conduct ceremony or to do the right things by a particular place, to for example make sure that the gaddy, the grass tree, keeps growing or the eels keep breeding, you know. So these kinds of increased ceremonies. In my country we had a snow making ceremony, which should please all the snow bunnies again. So we would call on the frosty moon, and we would call on the weather making elements of the world to bring on the snow. And of course that's important because then the snow in the spring melts and we have, you know, the alpine meadows continue and then it flowers. So everything is in a kind of cycle. So what we're doing in bringing people into our country for what we call corroboree as well, which are where we have a dance and a sing up. This should be familiar to everybody, really. If you bring people to your house for a birthday party or a special event, there's ceremony around that. So we do the same kind of thing, and you might sing happy birthday or acknowledge that person, and you know, you invoke all the rituals of that kind of ceremony. That's what we're doing too. But we're also making sure that the country itself knows that you are there. And an acknowledgement is that kind of thing. So you are acknowledging, if you're not having a formal welcome, if you're, say, starting a meeting like we did today, we're all on different countries. So Katie very appropriately said, wherever we are, we're all on Aboriginal country or potentially Torres Strait Islander country, and we are acknowledging that we're there. So I want you all to, if you don't know where you are, what Aboriginal country or Torres Strait Islander country you're on, have a think about it, find out what it is, and acknowledge to yourself. You can say it out loud. You can say, you know, I'm very pleased to be in Ngunnawal country, and to be, every day I enjoy being in this country, and I feel very supported and protected by the Ngunnawal community, who are welcoming me into their land.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jackie. Another point we have here, and we've, you know, had these conversations, we've done this in the past, is, and I think we had it as one of the polls there, Stephanie, as well, as like what acknowledgement to countries are memorable. And I think the answer to a lot of those kind of things that come up for me, and I'm certainly for you as well, is how we personalise our acknowledgement to country. So we've got one question here. Can you give us some ideas on how to vary the acknowledgement a little to keep it meaningful? If you want to say acknowledge, yeah, and if you want to say acknowledgement, I think for me it's that personalisation that makes it meaningful. And there's no one way to do that. Or I think with an acknowledgement is, you know, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you to be on the land that you are? What does it mean to you to engage with Aboriginal history, Australian history? And like, you know, Jackie talks about a lot Australian languages, and, you know, part of the conversation today is how we can embed that. I think some of the barriers to people doing acknowledgement to country is feeling that we need permission in order to do acknowledgement to country, and getting comfortable in that. And I think, you know, talking through that journey, I know the acknowledgements to country that I've been to across campus and elsewhere is about how that has meaning for that person who's, you know, giving that acknowledgement to country, and how it connects to the purpose of being at that event. Or and I think the more that the acknowledgement isn't disjointed from the main event that you're gathered for, I think that's where we bring meaning. And there is lots of ways that you can vary an acknowledgement. I think as long as the core purpose of why you're giving it is to acknowledge the people, and what Jackie's talked through there would be my perspective on that. And the frequency of, like, I think the question was also around how do you make it meaningful if you're doing it for a weekly event. And different ways I've seen across university is sharing around who's given the acknowledgement, you know. Even though those meetings may have a chair or someone who normally speaks or brings the meeting together, starts the meeting off, I think is how do we share around that. It really is an obligation to be on Aboriginal land, and what that means to us, what that means to us personally, to our teams, and the university as a whole, and our purpose in the broader context to be engaging with Indigenous researchers, Indigenous students, community members. I think there is a whole process of not just saying acknowledgement up front and then it doesn't actually engage in what we do on a day-to-day basis. So that would be my perspective on that.
I agree. I think it's important that everybody at some point in their week has a way of acknowledging the country that they're on and the people whose country they're on. And it doesn't mean that you have no right to be there. That's not, you know, back to my point originally, people worry too much, I think, about you know, the division between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. We live with the reality that Australia is now what it is. And there's a lot of talk at the moment in the press about racism. There's no doubt there is a lot of racism all over the world. It's a problem. And the sad thing is that Indigenous peoples particularly tend to be marginalised, because I think partly because people are uncomfortable with thinking about the Indigenous nature of the place that they're in. But it's actually something that should be uplifting for you, for everybody. I mean, we in Australia, we have a very small population and a very large amount of, you could say, wilderness country. Actually, even the areas that are farmed are very big areas compared to most other countries in the world. If everybody knew about Juukan Gorge, for example, that gorge that was blown up by Rio Tinto in the last week, I think that it wouldn't have happened, because if everybody in Australia understood the importance of the country and the landscape that they're living in, and felt that sense of acknowledgement of being there every day. We as Aboriginal people do it. I wouldn't go into Katie's country and not think to myself, I'm really fortunate to be in Wiradjuri country. And I think about my Wiradjuri friends and colleagues and elders that I know, and the importance of the place. And it feels different. That's another wonderful thing. Once you become, this is a kind of, doing acknowledgements is a way of opening up your mind to Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of thinking. This is, we all have an Indigenous past somewhere. Every single person has got some Indigenous connection somewhere. A lot of people say to me, I don't know what my Indigenous heritage would be if I even have any. Well, everybody's come from somewhere through their family lines, and many of us who are Aboriginal also have connections that are from other parts of the world, Indigenous or otherwise. But the core thing is, we go into a place and we have a sensibility about it as something that's alive. It's animate. Every rock, every tree, every grain of sand is something to be respected. It has a life force. One of the things that you would all know about is dreaming and storylines. You know, these are very commonly used terms in Australia, but not necessarily well understood. It may come as a big surprise to people to hear that some people have diarrhea dreaming. Some people have scabies dreaming. Not everybody has cute, fluffy possum dreaming, or you know, so your totem is something that other people would consider to be disgusting or hateful. Well, there is nothing disgusting and hateful in our world. Even I had a discussion recently with colleagues, with other Aboriginal people about COVID. For somebody, it's COVID dreaming. You cannot have something that comes into this country and is actually not of, not incorporated somehow. It has to be dealt with. And everything has, good and bad. In our traditions, we have a sense of good and bad, opposites. It's not necessarily always good and bad, but there are opposites. And that's how we organize ourselves as well. So in our marriage systems, we have eagle, hawk, and crow. These are considered to be birds that are quite different. So eagle, hawk marries crow, and vice versa. So in a very simplistic way, this is how we classify the world. So this is, again, the more you think about country, you acknowledge country. That's what acknowledgement of country is embodying the sense of the place. So whenever you do an acknowledgement, think about something about the place you're on that is meaningful and matters to you. It should be personal. It should be, first of all, thank you to the elders past and present. Thank you to the community for having me here. And you should be able to name the community or the language group that you're in, whose country you're in. In Sydney, it would be the clan group, because that's that well distinguished. But in addition to that, you should be able to say something about the country and speak to country, because if you speak to country, it will care for you and look after you.
Yeah. Great, Jackie, you got another one that's a very interesting question, not specifically around acknowledgement, but the notion, is an elder just an older and respected member of the community, or is it an official position within the community? And I think this question goes along with the lines of, that one around aunties and uncles and who we call aunties and uncles. And I actually go back to a conversation I had with a senior Aboriginal person, and he said, I'm not an old elder, I'm just an old Aboriginal man. Like that kind of process. I just was wondering if you could talk us through your perception on elders and the hierarchy within our communities.
Yeah, well, I think you've described it very well, Katie. I think, in our traditions, people gained respect as they went through law. So we have processes called in anthropology initiations, where people, as they progress through life, first of all, they become an adult. So there's a process for that. There's a ceremony around that. For everybody, there's a ceremony around becoming an adult. And then as you move along through your life, you are given access to more and more information, and it all connects to country. So it all gives you access to more and more knowledge about country. So this is why when we do welcomes to country, you want people who are knowledgeable about country, who are if they're not of the country, which in some cases they can't be anymore, because many people are living off their countries, but so there are other people who are speaking on country for that country who aren't necessarily from there. That's not just a new tradition, that's something that's always happened. But so people are given authority through respect. Community increasingly respects people for their knowledge, and certainly age is part of it, because you do progress as you get older through degrees of ceremony. And there are symbols, traditionally, again, people wore symbols. So you'll see red headbands on ochred red headbands on Aboriginal men of high degree, as they've been described in the anthropological literature, for men who've been through very senior ceremony. Again, for women, there are ways of acknowledging with various dress, various symbols. The possum skin cloaks that people talk about, that are something very important in cold country. People were given these as signs of respect. People collaborated on making them. People would wear things that signified them as elders. I mean, we now wear community respect as our main badge of being an elder. I would say that within communities, people know who's an elder and who isn't. And it still has something to do with age, but it's not absolutely about age. It's about how that person has represented community, how they have gained knowledge about country and place and people and what they know. The people who can recite everybody's genealogies, the people who know about place and its significance. And these are all the kinds of things that come together to create someone who is knowledgeable, but most of all respected and widely respected.
Yeah, great. So we've got about 5 more minutes. I just thought that we've got quite a few questions around when it's appropriate to acknowledge. Is it for all lectures and tutorials, which work meetings, and that kind of process. I think it also goes on the line, when should we do a welcome, when should we do acknowledgement? From my perspective on that one, I think because we are saying that when it's personal, when it's meaningful for you is when we should be doing them. So I wouldn't recommend doing it at every lecture if that is just a rote thing that you're saying and it doesn't bring meaning. So I think how do you bring that acknowledgement up front and interact it into the course material? I think those linkages and acknowledging that in both sides of that side of the dialogue, I think is important. I think it's how do we transform our culture on campus to being, hey, it doesn't have to be an elaborate thing. Acknowledgement, like Jackie says, just to worry me, welcoming people with Aboriginal language. That's acknowledgement. I think you are welcoming people into your meeting rooms, into your classrooms. How do we do that in a traditional way, potentially and like every single person has a different journey on how they embed acknowledgement and Aboriginal culture into their way of life. So I think there are so many different ways of how you can do it when it's appropriate. I think it's always appropriate. And then it's up to the person on how you actually engage with that.
Whenever when I was a full-time lecturer, my practice, and also school teacher, my practice was to begin the day or the class, if it was a lecture, with it's great to be here. My last job was lecturing at the University of Canberra, so great to be here on Ngunnawal country. Aren't we fortunate to be able to enjoy this country and the wisdom of its people? So I think it's good to bring to people's attention. I agree with Katie, it shouldn't just be something you read out as a sort of formulaic thing, but you should, when I say that, it would bring to the attention of my students that they were on Aboriginal land, and that it was not a matter of them, back to my point about not a matter of excluding people or saying, isn't it, this is the case that we've taken over, myself included as a Ngurrugu person coming onto Ngunnawal land, we haven't taken over this land, we're grateful to be able to be there. And the reality is that all our countries in Australia now have lots of other people living on them, which is not how it would have been in the past. People would have been invited in for periods of time or married in, or, you had a reason for being there. But in many ways that applies now too. People are married into the Aboriginal communities, and people who live and work on Aboriginal lands are a part of the wider community. We incorporate people, and the acknowledgements are a way of continuing your understanding of being incorporated.
Yeah. Jackie, we've got another one here. When doing the acknowledgement, it seems a bit token to just read the standard text, but I worry a more informal approach might not be respectful. Any advice? And I think, like we're saying, the informal is good. It's not saying it's informal or formal, but it's just saying that personalised approach gives it more meaning. And I think if you're doing that in a respectful way, you're talking out of respect, that's respectful. And so I wouldn't worry so much about, getting the words right, or I think it's really how do you make the heart of the message across, and we get better. And every time I give one, I do it in different ways. I've been asked to do ones at universities and big things, and normally I do like to bring my language into my acknowledgements. But at the end of the day, it's just that, that getting your heart of why you do acknowledge country and why you think it's meaningful, I think is where the value is.
And, you know, honestly, there is really nothing wrong with, if you're not comfortable, if you've got a little script you want to read, just read it. I mean, I think the main thing is, as Katie was saying, is don't just read it and all that's done, you know, now onto the, it's, you know, read it because you want to be reading it. Or don't do an acknowledgement if it's not going to be something that you feel comfortable doing. I mean, you don't have to do it all the time for everything. Welcomes are very important, I think, where you have an event on somebody's country. I think that's something that I would say is almost mandatory, like starting a conference, particularly a big international one. If you've got other Indigenous people coming from around the world, just remember this is not only an Australian Indigenous practice, this is international. Indigenous people everywhere have ways of welcoming people in. If you go across the ditch to New Zealand, you might actually encounter a full-blown pohiri, as they say, where there are warriors coming up to you with spears, shaking them at you with a fern leaf in their hand that you have to maintain there, or a man would have to maintain eye contact with the warrior as he puts the fern on the ground. And back in the day, if you lost eye contact, that'd be the moment you lost your life. So potentially, you know, so there are, you know, the welcomes are really all about following through practices that have very ancient histories but are absolutely of the moment now. Just because something's got a long practice doesn't mean that it's some kind of ancient tradition. Traditions are very much of the here and now.
Thanks, Jackie. I would like to thank Professor Jakelin Troy and all of you who come in here today and listening to our attempts of trying to demystify the acknowledgement to country. We've had a few requests for resources, so the team will send around some links of things that we find useful, but you're welcome to go out there and explore and get your own resources as well. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to say didgeridoo, which is thank you in the language of Sydney, to the Gadigal, the Sydney language, to Katie for working with me. We've done this performance now a couple of times. It is sort of a performance, but it's a very important opportunity to share our own views of acknowledgements and welcomes to country as Aboriginal people. So didgeridoo, thank you.
Didgeridoo.
Yanu, goodbye.